Frida Gunnardóttir's axe cut through the air with lethal precision, stopping mere millimeters from the throat of the kneeling Saxon. Her icy blue eyes, once fierce, now overflowed with hesitation. The prisoner did not avert his gaze, accepting his fate with a dignity that unsettled her. Behind her, Jarl Thorvald smiled with approval, while the Shieldmaiden's heart silently shattered, torn between duty and a forbidden feeling that should never have existed. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the harsh and compelling world of the Vikings. This channel is just beginning, and every subscription means the world to us. It keeps this project alive and helps us reach that all-important first 1,000 subscribers. If you enjoy the story, please consider subscribing and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Your support truly makes a difference. The dawn broke softly over the fjord, its pale light painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold. A gentle mist lingered above the water's surface, wrapping the village of Ravenholm in a quiet, almost sacred stillness. The air was crisp, sharp with the lingering bite of early spring, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and pine that clung stubbornly to the slopes surrounding the settlement. The distant cries of seabirds echoed faintly, their wings slicing through the cold morning air as they hunted for the day's first catch. On the edge of the village, near a cluster of sturdy wooden longhouses, a lone figure moved with deliberate grace. Frida Gunnardóttir stood with her back to the fjord, the rising sun casting a fiery glow onto her tangled red hair. Her fingers, calloused and steady from years of wielding weapons instead of sewing needles, traced the worn edge of her battle-axe. The cold metal sang faintly as she sharpened its blade against a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel mingling with the soft rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of her people beginning their daily tasks. She was 26 winters now, the years marked upon her not just in age, but in scars. Pale lines crossing her shoulder and forearm, silent testaments to battles fought and survived. Yet, despite the hardened exterior, there was a restlessness in her expression this morning, a flicker of uncertainty beneath her usual stoic gaze. Her blue eyes, icy and resolute in battle, now softened momentarily as they drifted toward the horizon, where the fjord met the sky in a seamless blur of mist and light. It was a quiet morning, but not one untouched by worry. The village had seen its share of hardship these past seasons. Though the longhouses were sturdy and the walls of the settlement stood firm, the shadow of war loomed ever near. The memory of the last bloody raid, where many brave souls had fallen defending their land against Saxon invaders, still haunted the minds of Ravenholm's people. Frida herself bore the weight of loss. Her husband, a fierce warrior, had died during that fateful summer, his life claimed by the very enemies now held captive within their walls. Despite the grief that clung to her like a second skin, Frida moved with purpose. Her role as Shieldmaiden was not a gentle one. It demanded strength beyond mere muscle and skill beyond the swing of an axe. She was a protector, a warrior forged not only by the gods, but by the hard realities of this unforgiving land. Raised by her father, Gunnar Haraldsson, a man whose name was spoken with reverence for his valor, she had been trained from childhood in the arts of war. Her place beside the men of Ravenholm was earned with sweat and blood. And though some still questioned a woman's place on the battlefield, there was no denying her prowess. The sound of footsteps approaching pulled her from her reverie. Thyra, her younger sister, came into view, her lighter red hair catching the sun as she moved swiftly, yet with a solemnity that set her apart from the usual bustle of village life. Thyra's hands bore the faint stains of blue and indigo dyes from the morning's weaving, a stark contrast to Frida's calloused fingers. "The Jarl seeks you," Thyra said quietly, eyes flickering away, as if afraid to meet the storm gathering behind Frida's gaze. He is impatient. Frida's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. I will go at once. She secured her axe to her belt, the weight familiar and reassuring. The morning air seemed to grow heavier as she made her way through the village, the wooden planks and packed earth beneath her boots echoing the rhythm of her heartbeat. Her path led to the great hall of Ravenholm, a towering structure of timber and stone, its walls etched with runes and adorned with trophies from battles past. Smoke curled from the chimney, the scent of burning wood mingling with the faint aroma of roasted meat. Inside, the hall was cool and dim, lit by flickering torches that cast long shadows upon the faces of those gathered. Jarl Thorvald Ragnarsson sat at the head of the long table, his presence commanding even in the quiet moments before the council convened. His broad shoulders filled the chair like a mountain, the golden light catching the strands of gray woven through his dark hair. His eyes, cold and unyielding like the steel of his sword, fixed on Frida as she entered. The large golden bracelet on his right arm gleamed, a symbol of wealth and power that few dared to challenge. Frida Gunnardóttir. His voice rumbled through the hall, carrying the weight of authority. Yesterday, our scouts returned with news. He paused, allowing the anticipation to swell in the silent room. They have captured a Saxon of high birth. A tense murmur swept through the gathered warriors and advisors. Frida's grip tightened on the hilt of her axe, her pulse quickening. The mention of Saxons was never welcomed lightly, enemies who had long sought to breach their lands with fire and steel. Thorvald continued, stepping down from his seat to approach her. He is no common soldier. From what we have learned, through his language and his belongings, this man may be kin to his king. His lips curved into a thin smile, laced with a cunning that made Frida's stomach twist uneasily. His ransom could bring great wealth to Ravenholm. Frida inclined her head, understanding the unspoken order. Prisoners of rank were valuable chess pieces in the game of power and survival. I will watch over him, she answered, her voice steady despite the unease stirring within. I speak some of their tongue, and will not let him escape. Thorvald's gaze sharpened. He lowered his voice to a near whisper, meant only for her ears. Tonight, after the feast, we will speak of your future as well, Frida. There is a matter that concerns the strength and lineage of our people, and you. The words hung in the air, heavy as the sword belts worn by the warriors assembled. Frida felt the old knot of dread tighten in her chest. She knew what was coming, the proposal that would bind her fate to the Jarl's, a union not born of love, but of alliance and duty. The hall emptied slowly, the buzz of voices and clinking of tankards fading into the growing evening shadows. Frida lingered for a moment, watching Thorvald's retreating figure as he conferred with his closest advisers. Her thoughts spiraled back to the day before, to the images burned in her mind, the bloodied fields, the cries of the fallen, and the cold steel that had taken her husband from her. Her feet led her next to the fringes of the village, where the prison was held. The makeshift cell was a crude affair, a wooden structure repurposed from an old barn, its walls lined with rough planks and a thick layer of straw covering the dirt floor. The air inside was thick with the scent of sweat, damp straw, and something faintly metallic. 2 guards stood just outside, their faces stern and watchful. Frida pushed open the heavy door, the creak of hinges breaking the silence. Inside, in the dim light filtering through narrow slats, sat the prisoner. His posture was calm, almost regal, despite the chains that bound his wrists. His hair was dark and unkempt, framing a face marked by a fresh scar along the temple, and a beard trimmed with care. His eyes were a piercing green, thoughtful and steady as they met hers without fear or defiance. "Water," Frida offered in his language, the word rough on her tongue, but clear in meaning. She held out a leather skin filled with cool liquid. Eadric accepted it cautiously, nodding once in gratitude before drinking deeply. His gaze did not waver. "My name is Eadric," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a foreign accent. "Son of Elfric of Wessex." Frida's breath caught. He spoke their language, though haltingly. "You speak our tongue?" "A little," he replied. "Learned it from merchants before the war." His words carried no bitterness, only a quiet acceptance of fate. Unlike many prisoners she had known, Eadric carried himself with dignity, commanding a respect that unsettled Frida's carefully guarded heart. She studied him, the wooden cross hanging from his neck, the fine but now tattered clothes that marked his noble birth, the fire in his eyes despite captivity. Questions tugged at her mind, unspoken but urgent. "Why are you so far from your home, Eadric of Wessex?" she asked carefully, keeping her distance. The chill of the cell wrapped around them like a shroud. "Not by choice," he answered, a bitter smile touching his lips. "A storm at sea. My ship was lost. I survived when others did not." There was no self-pity in his voice, only a quiet strength that resonated with Frida's own resolve. For hours they exchanged cautious words. Her simple questions met with his stories of distant lands, ancient texts, and the knowledge he carried beyond the sword. He spoke of poetry, medicine, and the wisdom found in books, a world far removed from the relentless clamor of battle and bloodshed. When she brought him food, a humble meal of dried meat and coarse bread, Frida realized she had spent more time in the prisoner's company than she had intended. There was a strange bond forming between them, fragile and forbidden, shaped by respect and something deeper she dared not name. That night the great hall of Ravnholm thrummed with life. Warriors drank deeply, their laughter loud and raw, stories of valor and conquest filling the smoky air. Frida sat beside Thorvald, her role as Shieldmaiden and heir apparent to his favor weighing heavily on her. The Jarl's hand briefly touched hers, a possessive gesture that stirred a tumult of emotions she struggled to contain. "Has the Saxon caused you trouble?" Thorvald asked, sensing her distraction. "No," she replied cautiously. "He is unexpectedly calm." Thorvald nodded, satisfied. "Good. Tomorrow messengers will ride to his kin. The ransom will enrich our village." His words were a promise, but also a command. The future was being shaped, and Frida was at the center of it. As the night wore on, the Jarl announced his intentions before all. "Frida Gunnardóttir," his voice rang clear, "daughter of Gunnar Haraldsson, skilled in battle and worthy of honor, I ask that you become my wife when the moon is full." The room fell silent, all eyes fixed on the Shieldmaiden. To accept would mean security, prestige, and the end of uncertainty. It was what her people expected, what her father would have wished. But as Frida looked inward, the faces of those she loved, the memory of the prisoner's green eyes, and the whisper of her own restless heart collided in a storm of doubt. The path laid out before her was straight and narrow, but her soul ached for something more, a choice that belonged to her alone. "Give me until morning," she said softly, her voice steady despite the tempest within, "to seek the gods and honor my father's memory." Thorvald's smile was thin but approving. "A warrior's answer. Tomorrow, then." The night passed in restless shadow, the quiet of Frida's cabin broken only by the distant howl of wolves and the ceaseless wind. Memories and possibilities danced in her mind like flickering flames. chains that bound her, and the first glimmers of a freedom she had never dared to imagine. Before the sun rose, she slipped once more toward the prison, the mist still clinging to the earth like a veil. The guards parted at her command as she stepped inside to face Eadric, whose gaze met hers with a mixture of curiosity and something unspoken. "The jar will decide today," she told him, voice low and heavy with unspoken meaning. "And so shall I." He studied her, understanding deeper than words could say. "What do you mean?" Frida hesitated, the weight of duty and desire pulling her in opposite directions. "He asked me to marry him, and I must choose." Eadric's eyes softened. "That choice is yours to make, Frida Gunnardóttir." For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, one not dictated by tradition or expectation, but by her own hand. A life where the strength of her spirit mattered as much as the strength of her arm. Outside, the village stirred with anticipation. The day of judgment had arrived, and with it the moment when chains might be broken. Not only those of iron, but those forged by fate itself. The wind clawed at the edges of Ravenholm, a cold breath that whispered warnings through the wooden beams and snow-dusted rooftops. The day was waning, yet the sky remained a slate gray, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to surrender the light. Frida Gunnardóttir moved silently through the narrow alleys near the outer edge of the settlement, her eyes sharp beneath the heavy hood that concealed her fiery hair. The weight of her axe at her side was a familiar comfort, grounding her in a world that often seemed harsh and unyielding. Her mind was restless, tangled in thoughts of the morning's judgment and the rising storm within her soul. The Jarl's proposal lingered like a shadow, an unyielding expectation pressing against the fragile thread of her own desires. She had spent hours alone in the prisoner's cell, talking with Eadric, not as jailer and captive, but as two souls seeking meaning amid the turmoil of war and fate. Yet, even as the warmth of their conversations thawed the walls around her heart, duty gnawed relentlessly at her conscience. As she rounded a corner near the longhouse where the village's healers kept their herbs and salves, a soft whimper caught her ear, an almost imperceptible sound lost beneath the creaking of timber and the distant crackle of the hearth fires. She paused, listening intently. The plaintive noise came again, trembling and fragile. Frida's footsteps slowed. The settlement's outskirts were seldom quiet, but this cry was different, not the call of beasts, nor the laughter of children at play. It was a plea, raw and desperate. She followed the sound, her breath clouding in the sharp evening air, until she reached a narrow alley pressed between two crumbling stone walls. There, curled against the base of a broken cart, was a figure so small and shivering that Frida's heart clenched before her mind could catch up. A girl, no more than 8 winters old, with tangled hair stained by dirt and tears, wrapped in scraps of threadbare cloth that did little to guard her against the cold. Her eyes, wide, haunted, locked onto Frida's immediately, reflecting a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Frida knelt slowly, careful not to startle the child. The girl's body shook, barely able to hold back her sobs. "Little one," Frida said softly, her voice low and steady like a bomb. "What happened? Why are you here all alone?" The girl's lips trembled. They took everything. My father, my mother." Her words broke, swallowed by a choked sob. Frida's jaws clenched, the familiar ache of loss rising like a tide. The raids had been ruthless, and the scars on Ravenholm's people were deep. But here, in this small, trembling form, grief became painfully intimate, a raw wound she could not ignore. "Who took them?" she asked, her eyes searching the child's pale face. "Men, strangers. They came in the night. I ran away." The girl's voice was barely a whisper, the weight of her terror pressing down like stone. Frida's mind raced. To bring the child into the village was to invite risk. There were enemies still lurking beyond the forests, and suspicion ran high toward outsiders or those suddenly appearing at the edges of the settlement. Yet to leave her here was to sentence her to the cold wilderness, where wolves and hunger awaited without mercy. A deep conflict stirred within Frida. The Shieldmaiden's training demanded caution. Her role was to protect the clan, but also to preserve strength and order. Was this child a threat to that order? Or was she one more fragile soul, caught in the endless web of war's cruelty? The child's eyes flickered up again, as if sensing the turmoil behind the warrior's steady gaze. "Please," she whispered, "do not leave me." Frida reached out, her rough hand hovering uncertainly before resting gently on the girl's trembling shoulder. The warmth of contact, fragile as it was, seemed to steady both of them in that moment. Two beings clinging to each other in a world undone. "Come," Frida said finally, her voice firm despite the turmoil inside. The girl nodded, relief washing over her face like the first light after a long night. Frida helped her to her feet, wary of the thin frame that trembled beneath the ragged clothes. There was no time to waste. As they moved through the village's winding paths, Frida's thoughts churned relentlessly. The Jarl's court would not welcome unexpected guests, especially those without kin or status. Bringing the child to Thorvald could invite questions, perhaps suspicion, or worse. Yet the Shieldmaiden's heart, so often steeled against the world, refused to harden completely. She remembered the faces lost to war, the empty spaces where laughter once lived. And in the child's frightened gaze she saw a reflection of all that was vulnerable and precious, something worth fighting for beyond the clash of swords and the politics of power. Back at her cabin, Frida set the girl near the fire, her hands moving quickly to strip the damp, tattered rags and replace them with a cloak woven by her sister Thyra, soft, warm, and dyed in deep blues that mirrored the fjord's depths. The child's small body shivered less, the warmth seeping into her bones like a promise. Frida busied herself with fetching water and preparing a simple broth, the mundane tasks grounding her as the weight of decisions pressed down. She knew that keeping the child hidden was only a temporary reprieve. The village would notice, the Jarl would demand answers, and the fragile threads of harmony could unravel swiftly. That night, as the fire crackled low and the girl finally drifted into restless sleep, Frida sat by the window, watching the stars blink to life in the darkening sky. The constellations were ancient, silent witnesses to countless tales of courage and despair, of choices made and paths forsaken. Her thoughts returned to Eadric, the Saxon prisoner, whose presence complicated everything she had believed about loyalty and destiny. In him she glimpsed a world beyond the fjord's frozen edges, a life shaped not by iron chains, but by the courage to choose. Yet here, in her cabin, surrounded by the fragile breath of a child spared from death's clutch, the stakes were painfully clear. Compassion was a dangerous weapon in times such as these, one that could cut just as deeply as any blade. Frida's fingers traced the amulet of Freya at her neck, a talisman of love, war, and transformation. She whispered a prayer, not for victory, nor for power, but for guidance, for the strength to navigate the impossible, to protect those who could not protect themselves, and to claim the life that had always seemed just beyond reach. When morning came, the village stirred with its usual bustle, but beneath the surface, Frida carried the weight of a secret and a promise. She had chosen to face the unknown, to carry the burden not only of battle, but of mercy. And in that choice, something within her shifted, an ember of hope smoldering beneath the ash of duty. The day ahead would demand more than steel and strategy. It would require courage of a different kind, a courage born not of conquest, but of heart. The chill of dawn still clung to the air as Frida carried the fragile figure of the girl through the winding paths of Ravnholm. Each step was measured, careful not to jostle the child who rested her head against Frida's shoulder, her breath shallow and uneven. The village was slowly awakening, smoke curling from chimneys, the soft clatter of wooden wheels over packed earth, the distant lowing of cattle. Yet in Frida's mind, the world had narrowed to the small warmth pressed against her, a fragile ember amid the cold. The girl's dark eyes fluttered open briefly, reflecting the cold gray light of morning. She murmured something in a language foreign to Frida, a string of soft syllables that slipped through the warrior's hearing like a breeze. She bent her head, attempting a gentle smile, though her own heart throbbed with uncertainty and the weight of responsibility. The longhouse they reached was modest, nestled at the edge of the settlement, beneath a canopy of evergreens that whispered with the wind. Frida's sister, Thyra, was already awake, her slender figure silhouetted against the dim glow of the hearth inside. Threads of red-gold hair framed Thyra's pale face as she looked up, surprise flickering in her wide eyes. "Frida," Thyra breathed, rising swiftly to meet them. Her gaze fell immediately upon the child, and something soft stirred in her expression. Compassion, perhaps, or the shared understanding of loss. Without a word, Frida opened the door, letting the cold air sweep inside before stepping through. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them like a protective shroud, carrying scents of pine smoke, dried herbs, and the faint sweetness of baking bread. The child stirred, eyes widening as the brightness enveloped her, and for a moment Frida saw something fragile flicker, a spark of hope. Thyra moved with gentle purpose, guiding the girl to a small bed draped with thick furs near the hearth. The child's limbs were stiff from cold and exhaustion. She curled into herself, seeking whatever warmth she could find. Thyra knelt beside her, unraveling the thin, tattered cloak and uncovering bare arms, pale as birch bark, marred by faint bruises and dirt smudges. Her fingers hovered a moment before brushing away a stray lock of hair, soft as a whispered prayer. Frida stepped back, leaning against the timber wall, her breath steady but her heart pounding. The sight of the child, vulnerable, silent, broke something open within her, a dam long held against the flood of emotion she rarely allowed herself to acknowledge. She touched the amulet at her neck, a small pendant carved in the shape of Freya's sacred falcon, and whispered an unspoken plea for strength and guidance. Thyra fetched a bowl of warm water and a cloth, moving with quiet care to cleanse the grime from the child's face and hands. The girl flinched at first, startled by the unfamiliar touch, but soon relaxed beneath the soft ministrations. When a small faded tattoo, a delicate knotwork circlet, became visible on the child's wrist, Thyra's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. Such marks were rare among their people, and the pattern seemed more aligned with distant lands, a subtle signature of a heritage unknown to them. "Where do you come from, little one?" Thyra whispered, her voice as gentle as the breeze outside. The child's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, her gaze slid toward Frida, lingering on the scarred Shieldmaiden with a mixture of curiosity and silent plea. Frida stepped forward, kneeling beside Thyra and the girl. She reached into her pouch, retrieving a piece of dried smoked fish and a small chunk of dark bread. Offering the food with steady hands, she spoke slowly in the Old Norse tongue, the words soft and deliberate. "Eat," she said. "You need strength." The child hesitated, eyes flickering between the offering and the faces before her. Then, with a shaky nod, she accepted the food. Her small teeth bit into the bread, and the flicker of hunger, a basic, primal need, was clear in the way she ate. The room settled into a quiet rhythm, the crackle of the fire, the soft rustling of furs, the muted sounds of the village beyond. Words remained scarce, replaced by glances and gestures that spoke volumes. Frida caught herself watching the child's hands, noting how they trembled slightly, yet held a subtle grace, as if trained or accustomed to delicate tasks, a stark contrast to her own hardened fingers shaped by axe and shield. There was a quiet dignity in the girl's posture despite her weakness, a resilience that felt at odds with the ragged appearance. The child's gaze found Frida's again, green eyes shimmering faintly in the firelight. It was a look that carried both fear and an unspoken question, perhaps a plea for trust or for understanding beyond words. Frida's throat tightened. She wanted to say something, words of comfort, promises of safety, but the language barrier held her back. Instead, she reached out cautiously, placing a rough hand over the child's, letting the warmth speak where speech failed. Thyra smiled softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You are safe here," she assured in her gentle voice, the words wrapping around the room like a vow. Night pressed closer, casting long shadows across the timber walls. Outside, the world grew quiet, save for the distant howl of wolves, a reminder of the wildness that lurked beyond their fragile sanctuary. Inside, the fire's glow painted a fragile sanctuary of warmth and light. The girl's breathing deepened, eyelids heavy, as the exhaustion claimed her. Frida sat nearby, her mind restless, but her posture vigilant. She felt the weight of the amulet at her neck once more, a symbol of protection and transformation. Her thoughts drifted to Eadric, the Saxon prisoner. The strange bond they had forged in stolen moments, words exchanged beneath the watchful eyes of the Jarl and the ever-present shadow of fate. There was something about Eadric's quiet strength, his knowledge, and his unwavering dignity that echoed the resilience she now saw mirrored in this child. As the night deepened, Frida allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The world she inhabited was one of iron and blood, where survival demanded sacrifice and loyalty to clan and kin. Yet here, in this small cabin warmed by fire and newfound trust, there was a flicker of something more. Whispers of mercy, of choice, of paths untaken. The child stirred, eyes fluttering open once more, meeting Frida's gaze with an almost imperceptible nod. In that fleeting moment, a silent understanding passed between them. A promise that, whatever storms might come, neither would face them alone. Frida's fingers tightened briefly around the haft of her axe before relaxing. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and hard choices. But in the fragile breath of this night, amidst the crackling flames and the watchful gaze of the gods above, she felt the first stirrings of hope. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the distant sea. The stars, ancient and unblinking, held their silent vigil. And within the small cabin, a Shieldmaiden and a lost child found a fragile refuge, a place where trust could take root, and where the future, though unknown, shimmered with possibility. The news traveled faster than the winter wind that howled through the towering pines beyond Ravnholm. What had begun as a whispered secret confined to the cracked wooden walls of a small cabin near the village's edge soon slipped through the fingers of silence and spilled into the open air. The presence of the lost child, sheltered by Frida Gunnardóttir, the Shieldmaiden known both for her fierce loyalty and unyielding spirit, did not remain hidden for long. As dawn broke, the murmurs began, soft at first, then gaining strength like the rising tide. A stranger in the settlement, a child found alone and frightened, sparked curiosity. And curiosity, among the wary and watchful people of the north, soon bred suspicion. Frida felt the weight of those eyes before she even stepped outside her cabin. The villagers moved cautiously, but with purpose, their gazes flickering between the small figure in the doorway and the Shieldmaiden standing protectively beside her. Mothers clutched their children a little tighter. Fishermen paused their work to exchange hushed words, and hunters lowered their weapons, their faces etched with unspoken questions. The unspoken rule of the settlement was clear. Outsiders were dangers to be watched, tested, and, if necessary, cast out. Her sister Thyra was the first to speak, her voice trembling with the fragile hope that had been nurtured in that small room. "They see the child," she whispered, glancing toward the gathering crowd. "They want answers." Frida's jaw tightened. They will get none that put her in harm's way. Yet, even as she declared her defiance, the Shieldmaiden could feel the invisible noose tightening. The delicate balance between mercy and survival was a precarious one, and the consequences of tipping the scales weighed heavily on her conscience. By midday, a delegation had formed. Elders, warriors, and a few of the village's most trusted voices, led by Halfdan the Wise, the venerable counselor, whose sightlessness in one eye lent his gaze a haunting depth. His approach was slow, deliberate, his staff striking the earth with a rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of Ravnholm itself. When he stopped before Frida and the child, the gathered crowd fell into a respectful silence, broken only by the crackle of leaves beneath boots. "Frida Gunnardóttir," Halfdan began, his voice low, yet carrying with the authority of years steeped in the sagas and wisdom of the North. "The gods have seen fit to test you once more." Frida met his gaze squarely, her own eyes steady despite the turmoil inside. "I shelter the child. She is not a threat." Halfdan's weathered face betrayed no emotion as he nodded slowly. Threat or not, the village speaks in whispers. A child without kin invites questions, and with questions come eyes that watch too closely. He shifted his weight, leaning heavily on his staff. "If news of this reaches our neighbors, it will not long remain a secret. Tribes from the south, raiders beyond the fjord, they will see weakness where we seek strength. And strength is what keeps us alive." The reality of Halfdan's words settled over her like a mantle of frost. To protect the vulnerable was a sacred duty, but to invite danger upon those she had sworn to defend was a betrayal that could cost many lives. "I will protect her," Frida said, voice firm, "even if it means standing alone." Before Halfdan could respond, the crunch of heavy boots interrupted the moment. Jarl Thorvald entered the gathering, his presence commanding immediate attention. His grey eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the assembled villagers before settling on Frida. There was no warmth in his gaze, only the cold edge of authority. "The word spreads," Thorvald announced, his voice thick with warning. "A child hidden in the village. Who is responsible for this breach of order?" Frida stepped forward, her stance unwavering despite the quickening beat of her heart. "I am." Thorvald's lips curled into a thin, disapproving line. "There are no accidents in Ravnholm. Every choice carries weight." He turned to the crowd, his voice rising. "We face enemies who watch for signs of weakness. The Saxons' ransom is still a question. And now this, an unknown child sheltered without counsel or consent. This threatens the delicate balance of our survival." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some faces were etched with concern, others with anger. The Shieldmaiden's defiance had earned respect, but it also drew ire. "The Jarl speaks truth," Halfdan added, his voice calm but resolute. "We must consider the consequences for all. Where did she come from? What danger does she carry? These are questions we cannot ignore. Frida's gaze hardened. She carries only fear and loss. That is danger enough in a world where compassion is scarce. A sharp voice cut through the tension. Compassion will not keep us safe when the wolves come hunting. It was Bjorn, a grizzled hunter, known for his blunt words and unwavering loyalty to the clan's security. His eyes narrowed as they met Frida's. We have enemies beyond these woods. To harbor strangers is to invite their wrath. The Shieldmaiden swallowed the urge to retort. Even she knew the truth in Bjorn's words. The world beyond the fjord was a tapestry of shifting alliances and ancient grudges. Ravnholm could not afford to appear fractured or soft. Yet, as the council debated, Frida's heart clenched with a growing sense of isolation. The child's trembling form, wrapped in the cloak Thyra had woven, was a fragile beacon amid the storm of suspicion. Her small hands clung to Frida's, seeking reassurance in a sea of uncertainty. As the day waned, a new threat emerged. Scouts reported the approach of riders from a neighboring tribe, their banners unfamiliar but unmistakably hostile. Rumors had long whispered of tensions over hunting grounds and river access, disputes that had escalated in the harsh winter months. The arrival of these riders was a stark reminder that Ravnholm did not exist in isolation. Every decision, every act of mercy or defiance rippled outward across the frozen landscape like cracks in ice. Jarl Thorvald wasted no time. "Prepare the warriors," he commanded, his voice steel. "We will meet these visitors with strength, but also with caution. Let them see we are united." Frida caught the fleeting glance exchanged between Halfdan and the Jarl, a silent acknowledgment that the settlement's fragile peace was hanging by a thread. That night, as the village braced for potential conflict, Frida sat by the fire in her cabin, the child resting nearby. The flames flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mimic the turmoil in her mind. She traced the worn edge of her axe, the weight of it grounding her in the present. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of distant fires and restless horses. The sound was a reminder that the world beyond was vast and unforgiving, and that the sanctuary she sought to build was perilously fragile. Her thoughts drifted to Eadric, the Saxon prisoner, whose presence complicated everything. His knowledge, his calm defiance, the strange kinship that had blossomed between them, all these were threads woven into the tapestry of her conflicted heart. Could she protect both the child and the man while standing firm against the mounting storm? Could the Shieldmaiden who had once wielded her axe with unyielding resolve now defend the fragile bonds of mercy and hope? As the first light of dawn seeped through the wooden shutters, Frida rose, her blue eyes clear and resolute. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril and sacrifice, but for the first time the choice was hers alone to make. The village stirred slowly awake beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the air thick with both anticipation and the lingering chill of night. Word of the child's presence and Frida's defiance had not only unsettled Ravnholm, but had begun to draw attention beyond its borders. Traders from distant settlements, travelers bearing news from the south, and even scouts from rival clans now whispered of the Shieldmaiden who had turned away the Jarl's proposal and harbored an unknown child in defiance of tradition. Frida's every movement was shadowed by watchful eyes. Children she passed turned their heads away. Elders whispered in corners. Warriors cast uncertain glances her way. The delicate threads of trust she'd nurtured were fraying, and the village's fragile unity threatened to unravel. In the great hall, Jarl Thorvald convened a council of war. His voice was firm, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. We face threats not only from steel, but from the shadows of doubt within our own walls. If the child brings danger, and I suspect she does, then we must act decisively. Halfdan, seated beside the Jarl, nodded gravely. Wisdom tells us to question, yet to temper judgment with patience, but patience has its limits. Frida stood at the edge of the hall, her heart hammering. She knew the unspoken accusation hanging in the air, that by protecting the child she put all of Ravenholm at risk, that her choice, noble as it might be, was a gamble with lives. Outside, the distant sound of horns shattered the uneasy calm. Riders from the neighboring tribe had arrived at the settlement's gates, their banners bearing the mark of the Ravenclaw clan, a fierce group known for their merciless raids and grudges that ran deep. Thorvald's gaze sharpened. We will meet them as one, but remember this, our strength lies not only in arms, but in unity. Any sign of weakness will be exploited. As warriors donned their armor and prepared their weapons, Frida felt the invisible chains of expectation tighten once more. She was no longer just a shield maiden. She was a symbol, a lightning rod for the fears and hopes of her people. The child, nestled close in the cabin, stirred and opened wide eyes that reflected the flickering firelight. Frida reached out, fingertips brushing the fragile hand. The unspoken promise between them was clear. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together. Under the gathering storm clouds, the lines between friend and foe blurred, and the true battle began, not only for survival, but for the soul of Ravenholm itself. The gray clouds pressed low over Ravenholm, their heavy weight mirroring the oppressive tension that gripped the village like a tightening noose. The once vibrant settlement now hummed with a restless undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Warriors sharpened their blades with grim determination. Mothers gathered their children close, and elders murmured prayers to Odin and Freya alike, seeking guidance in the shadow of approaching peril. The distant rumble of war horns cut through the chill air, echoing from the encroaching forest line where the Ravenclaw clan had assembled, their banners casting dark silhouettes against the bleak horizon. Frida Gunnardóttir moved through the great hall with deliberate calm, though her heart thudded with a fierce urgency. The eyes of the clan were upon her, some filled with doubt, others with quiet defiance, and many with unspoken questions about the choices she had made. She carried with her the fragile form of the lost child, now wrapped in thick furs, her small hands clutching tightly at the Shieldmaiden's leather tunic. Thyra followed closely, her expression a mixture of concern and steadfast loyalty. The tension between duty and compassion had never felt so raw. At the center of the hall, Jarl Thorvald Ragnarsson sat upon his carved throne of oak and iron, his broad frame rigid with impatience. His cold gray eyes flicked toward Frida as she approached, the air between them charged with the weight of unspoken challenge. Beside him stood Halfdan the Wise, the elder's one blind eye gleaming beneath heavy brows, his staff planted firmly on the stone floor. The counselor's presence lent a solemn gravity to the gathering, a reminder that fate's scales were balanced delicately on their decisions. "The Ravenclaw have come with their war bands," Thorvald announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs like a sharpened blade. "They seek to test our will and claim what they believe is owed. Our scouts report their numbers are many, fierce, and relentless. We will not falter." A chorus of grunts and nods rippled through the crowd. Some warriors exchanged grim glances, hands tightening on their weapons. The weight of impending battle settled heavily on every soul present. Yet, beneath the surface, the real war was one of trust and loyalty, a battle for the heart of Ravenholm itself. Thorvald's gaze turned sharply to Frida. And what of the child you shelter, the Saxon prisoner whose ransom hangs like a shadow over us? How do you defend these choices when our enemies circle like wolves?" Frida met the Jarl's cold stare without flinching, the fire of resolve kindling within her icy blue eyes. The child is innocent, a soul lost to the ravages of war. To turn her away would be to invite the gods' wrath and the dishonor of our people. Her voice rang clear, steady despite the tumult inside. As for Eadric, he has shown wisdom beyond his captivity. He offers knowledge that may serve us well in the days ahead. I stand by my choices. Murmurs stirred, some voices whispering approval, others bristling with dissent. Bjorn, the grizzled hunter, stepped forward, his weathered face etched with suspicion. "Wisdom is costly, Shieldmaiden, and mercy is a weakness the Ravenclaw will exploit. We cannot afford to soften our hearts when blades are drawn." Frida's grip tightened on the child's small hand, feeling the fragile pulse beneath her fingertips. Strength is not only in steel, Bjorn. It is in the courage to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Halfdan raised a trembling hand, calling for silence. The gods see all, and their wisdom guides us through darkness. Today we face not only the enemy without, but the fears within. To cast out the vulnerable is to sever the ties that bind us as kin. Thorvald's expression hardened. Enough. Our people will fight as one. The shields will hold, the axes will fall, and the Ravenclaw will learn that Ravenholm does not yield. The hall erupted into a thunderous roar as warriors pounded their fists against shields, the sound echoing like thunder through the timbered walls. Frida felt the surge of adrenaline prickling her skin, the primal call to battle awakening the warrior spirit that had defined her since youth. Yet beneath the fierce exterior, a storm of doubt churned. How many would fall before the dawn? Could the child and the Saxon survive the coming chaos? Outside, the winds whipped fiercely, carrying with them the scent of smoke and pine resin. As the gates of Ravenholm creaked open, the first riders of the Ravenclaw clan emerged from the dark forest, their blackened armor gleaming dully beneath the heavy sky. Their raven-shaped banners fluttered ominously, the symbol of their ruthless reputation, known far and wide. Frida took up her place at the forefront of the warriors, the weight of her axe a familiar comfort against her side. Her eyes sought Eadric among the gathered crowd near the great hall. He stood tall despite his chains, his green eyes meeting hers with a quiet steadiness that belied the tension wrapping the village like a shroud. As the Ravenclaw war chief, a tall figure clad in black leather and iron, rode forward, Thorvald rose to meet him. The air between the leaders was thick with grudging respect and simmering hatred, a volatile mix as old as the land itself. Thorvald Ragnarson. The war chief's voice was low and gravelly, edged with menace. Ravenholm stands defiant, but the Ravenclaw demand tribute for the peace we bear this season. The Saxon prisoner is our price. Thorvald's jaw clenched. There will be no ransom paid to wolves who threaten the north. If you desire war, it shall be yours. The war chief's eyes flickered to Frida briefly, a Shieldmaiden known across clans for her fierce skill and unyielding will. And what of the Shieldmaiden who defies the Jarl's command? Does she bind the Saxon with chains of mercy? Such softness will be Ravenholm's doom. Frida stepped forward, her voice cutting through the cold wind like the edge of her axe. Mercy is a strength the Ravenclaw will never understand. We will not bow to threats or blood money. The people of Ravenholm stand united.
A tense silence fell, the two warbands poised on the knife edge of violence. Then, with a sudden roar, the Ravenclaw raised their weapons, the signal for battle. The air erupted into chaos, the clash of steel, the cries of warriors, and the thunder of hooves filled the clearing as the attack commenced. Frida fought with the fury of the gods, her axe swinging in deadly arcs, each strike fueled by a desperate need to protect the fragile future she had dared to claim. The child was hurried to safety by Thyra and trusted villagers, their footsteps swift though heavy with fear. Amidst the swirling battle, Frida's eyes found Eadric's once more. Despite his chains, he moved with purpose, aiding the wounded and offering counsel to the healers. His calm presence was a stark contrast to the chaos, a beacon of steadiness. The fighting dragged on, hours marked by blood and fire, steel and sweat. Ravenholm's warriors held firm, their shields locked in unbreakable walls, their fury unmatched by the Ravenclaw's brutal assault. The tide of battle shifted with the setting sun, the enemy forced into retreat as night cloaked the battered landscape. Exhausted and bloodied, Frida stood among the broken bodies and shattered weapons, her breath ragged but her spirit unbroken. The cost had been great. Friends and kin lay fallen, but Ravenholm had endured. The Shieldmaiden's heart ached with the weight of survival, knowing that the path forward would demand even more sacrifice. As the fires of battle smoldered into dying embers, Thorvald approached Frida, his expression unreadable beneath dirt and sweat. "You fought well," he said gruffly, the edge of his usual command softened by grudging respect. "Your choices have cost us dearly, but perhaps—" Frida met his gaze, unwavering. "The future will be written by those willing to fight for it, not those who cling to old chains." Thorvald nodded slowly, the hard lines of his face shifting. "We have much to consider. The Saxons' ransom remains uncertain, and the child you protect, they are a symbol now, a fragile hope in a hardened world." Frida's thoughts turned to the child, asleep in the longhouse, safe for now, and to Eadric, whose quiet strength had changed her forever. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time she embraced the unknown, not as a prisoner of duty, but as the architect of her own destiny. In the quiet aftermath, as dawn broke over the fjord with soft, pale light, Ravenholm began to heal.
Wounds would mend, scars would fade, and stories of courage and defiance would ripple through the village for generations to come. Frida Gunnardóttir stood at the edge of the settlement, the cold breeze tugging at her cloak, her blue eyes fixed on the horizon where sky and sea met in endless possibility. The gods watched silently, their ancient gaze resting upon a warrior who had dared to choose her own path amidst the storm. The chains of tradition may have bound many, but she was free, free to walk into whatever future awaited, with strength, honor, and a heart unyielding. The dawn had barely touched the sky when the first murmurs of gratitude began to ripple through Ravenholm. The bitter taste of battle lingered in the air, mixing with the damp earth and the faint, smoky scent of fires slowly dying down. Frida Gunnardóttir stood quietly near the edge of the village, her breath rising in pale clouds before dissolving into the cold morning air. The weight of the past days pressed heavily on her shoulders, yet beneath it all stirred a fragile hope, one born not of victory alone, but of the possibility for something new. Inside the longhouse where the child she had sheltered, the warmth of the fire fought against the chill that clung to the wooden walls. Thyra moved softly among the bundles of furs, tending to the smallest wounds and offering whispered comforts to those still shaken. The girl's breathing was steady now, the restless fear of days past replaced by a tentative trust.
It was in this quiet space that Frida allowed herself a moment to reflect on the battles fought, the choices made, and the uncertain path that lay ahead. Word of the Shieldmaiden's courage and compassion had traveled swiftly, spreading beyond the immediate circle of warriors and elders. The initial suspicion and fear that had surrounded the child's arrival began to thaw under the weight of undeniable truth. The girl was no threat, but a symbol of resilience in a world fractured by violence. Even Bjorn, the gruff hunter, whose voice had once carried the sharp edge of distrust, had softened in the wake of Frida's unyielding defense. The turning point came quietly, without ceremony. It was Eadric, the Saxon nobleman whose presence had complicated so many lives, who stepped forward as a voice of reason and gratitude. Despite his chains, his posture was upright, his green eyes steady with a calm that seemed to anchor the unsettled hearts around him. "I owe much to Frida Gunnardóttir," he declared, before the gathered villagers in the great hall, his voice clear and measured. "Not only for the life she has spared me, but for the kindness she has shown the child who arrived among us like a shadow fleeing the night." His words echoed through the hall, carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs. In times such as these, when the ways of the old collide with the winds of change, we find strength not only in steel, but in mercy and trust.
Thorvald Ragnarsson, the Jarl whose authority had seemed unshakable, regarded Eadric with a cautious gaze. The lines of his face softened just slightly, a subtle shift that did not escape the watchers. The council, once divided, now began to lean toward a fragile reconciliation. The hard edges of suspicion were dulled by the shared recognition of survival's true cost. Halfdan the Wise, leaning heavily on his carved staff, spoke next. His voice, though frail with age, carried the ancient authority of the sagas that had shaped their people. "The gods have tested us," he intoned, "and through the fires of conflict we have glimpsed the path to new understanding. It is not weakness to shelter the vulnerable, but wisdom. The threads of fate are woven not in isolation, but in the bonds we forge." Frida's gaze met Halfdan's, gratitude flickering in her icy blue eyes. The elder's words did not erase the scars of recent strife, nor the burdens each soul carried, but they offered a balm to the wounds inflicted by fear and division. Outside, the village slowly began to stir with renewed purpose. The wounds of battle demanded care, the fallen were mourned with solemn rites, and the stories of bravery, both on the field and in the quiet acts of compassion, were shared in hushed tones by the fireside. The child, once a source of suspicion and fear, was now embraced as a symbol of hope, her small hands clasped by those who had once questioned her presence. In the days that followed, Eadric's role within the settlement shifted from prisoner to valued advisor. His knowledge of healing herbs and distant customs proved invaluable, and under Frida's watchful eye, he taught the villagers new ways to tend wounds and read the stars for safer passage through treacherous waters. The bonds formed between the Saxon and the Viking Shieldmaiden deepened, not as captor and captive, but as equals navigating a world forever changed by war and chance. Thorvald, too, found a measure of respect for Frida's unwavering resolve. Though his proposal had been refused, he recognized in her the spirit of leadership that Ravnholm desperately needed. The Jarl's gaze, once cold and demanding, now carried a grudging acknowledgment of her right to choose her own path. The fragile peace that settled over the village was not born of ease, but of hard-won understanding. Frida stood before her people, no longer just a Shieldmaiden bound by duty, but a woman who had claimed her own destiny. The amulet of Freya at her neck caught the light of the setting sun, a symbol not only of war, but of transformation and love. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of twilight, Frida sat beside the fire outside her cabin. The child rested nearby, wrapped in warm furs, her eyes wide with wonder as stories of gods and heroes were told. Eadric joined her, the chains long removed, his presence calm and steady. Their conversation was quiet, full of shared reflections and tentative dreams for what might come.
"Your courage has changed more than you know," Eadric said softly, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "You have shown that strength is not measured by the swing of an axe alone, but by the heart that guides it." Frida's lips curved into a faint smile. "And you, Eadric, have taught me that knowledge can be a weapon just as sharp as any blade, that there is power in mercy and courage in choosing one's own path." Between them, the echoes of battles past and the whispers of future possibilities wove together, a tapestry of hope forged from the pain of loss and the promise of new alliances. As the stars emerged, ancient and unblinking, Frida felt the presence of the gods more keenly than ever. Their gaze was not judgmental, but watchful, bearing witness to a warrior who had dared to defy expectations and embrace the uncertain light of freedom. In Ravenholm, under the vast northern sky, the past and future met in quiet harmony. The Shieldmaiden's heart, once torn between duty and desire, had found its rhythm anew, steady, resolute, and fiercely alive. The road ahead held challenges yet unseen, but for now there was peace. And in that peace the promise of redemption, of healing, and of a life chosen by one's own hand. Frida's story was far from over. But in this moment of fragile calm, her spirit soared free, like the falcon of Freya's amulet, soaring high above the fjords and forests, embracing the endless horizon with fearless wings. The first light of dawn stretched gently over Ravenholm, casting a soft glow that seemed to cleanse the village of the shadows that had long clung to its timbered walls. The air was still crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and thawing earth, a subtle promise that winter's grasp was loosening. The village stirred slowly, each movement deliberate and measured, as if the people were waking not only from sleep, but from the weight of recent trials. The quiet was different now. Not the tense silence that had preceded battles, but a calm born of survival and hard-earned hope. Frida Gunnardóttir stood near the edge of the fjord, her gaze tracing the horizon where sky met sea in an unbroken line of pale blues and soft grays. The cold breeze tugged gently at the folds of her worn leather cloak, carrying the whisper of distant waves that lapped softly against the shore. Her hands, calloused and steady, rested lightly on the haft of her battle-axe, a familiar anchor amid the shifting currents of her life. Around her neck, the amulet of Freya caught the dawn's light, its delicate falcon seeming to stir with the promise of transformation. The village behind her slowly came to life. Smoke rose from chimneys, mingling with the scent of fresh bread baking over open fires. Children's laughter, tentative yet genuine, wove through the crisp morning air, a fragile melody that spoke of innocence reclaimed.
Traders and craftsmen moved about with renewed purpose, repairing longhouses, tending to livestock, and preparing for the seasons to come. The scars of war remained visible, splintered wood, stained earth, and the quiet absence of those lost. But they were no longer wounds that bled despair. Instead, they stood as silent monuments to endurance, to the fierce will that had kept Ravenholm standing. Inside the longhouse, where warmth spilled like honey from the hearth, the child who had once been a shadow at the village's edge now lay wrapped in thick furs, her breathing even and peaceful. Thyra, slender and gentle, moved quietly among the sleeping, her hands steady as she tended to small tasks. The girl's dark hair, once tangled and matted, was now brushed smooth, and her eyes, when they fluttered open, reflected a cautious curiosity rather than fear. Frida entered the room, with steps softened by the weight of the morning's peace. The sight of the child stirred something deep within her, a fierce tenderness that had grown through the days of hardship and quiet companionship. Here was a new beginning, fragile but undeniable. Thyra smiled softly, nodding in greeting. "She sleeps well," she whispered. "The village's kindness has touched her, though her heart still bears the wounds of what she has seen." Frida knelt beside the small bed, her gaze lingering on the pale face. She reached out gently, brushing a stray lock of hair from the girl's forehead. "You are safe now," she murmured, the words carrying a promise both to the child and to herself. "You belong with us." Outside, the village elders gathered once more in the great hall, their faces marked by thoughtfulness rather than suspicion. Halfdan the Wise sat beside Jarl Thorvald Ragnarsson, whose gray eyes now held a respect that had been absent in earlier days. The hard lines of command had softened into something more measured, a recognition that leadership required not only strength, but wisdom tempered by compassion. "The village has changed," Halfdan spoke quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years steeped in lore and memory. "Not simply because of battles fought, but because of hearts opened. The gods watch over those who dare to choose their own path." Thorvald nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping across the gathered council. "We have learned that survival is more than steel and fire. It is in the bonds we forge, in the mercy we offer, and in the courage to defy fear." The council's murmurs of agreement were low, but genuine. Among them, the faces of warriors and farmers, healers and hunters, all bound by the fragile threads of kinship renewed. Eadric of Wessex, once a prisoner whose fate had hung in the balance, now stood among the people of Ravnholm not as a captive but as a valued ally. The chains that had bound his wrists were gone, replaced by the trust he had earned through deeds and quiet strength. His green eyes, steady and contemplative, met Frida's across the hall, a silent acknowledgment of journeys shared and futures intertwined. "Your knowledge has become a light in our darkest days," Thorvald said, addressing the assembly. "From healing to navigating the stars, your wisdom has enriched us all." Eadric inclined his head, humility in every measured movement. "I owe this village more than words can express. And to Frida, who saw beyond the armor and the chains, I am forever grateful." Frida's gaze held a mixture of pride and something softer, a quiet warmth that had blossomed in the spaces between battle and duty. The woman who once stood alone at the edge of Ravnholm had become a bridge, between worlds, between old and new, between tradition and change. In the days that followed, the rhythms of Ravnholm settled into a new harmony. The longhouses echoed with stories told by firelight, tales of gods and heroes, of battles won and losses mourned, but also of mercy given and received. The child, now named Solveig by Thyra, grew in the care of the village's women, her laughter a balm to many wounds. Frida found herself walking among her people with a lighter step. The weight of expectation had not vanished, but it no longer pressed so heavily upon her spirit. Instead, a quiet certainty guided her actions, a belief that strength came not only from the arm that wielded an axe, but from the heart that dared to choose.
One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with hues of amber and crimson, Frida and Eadric stood by the shore. The fjord stretched before them, vast and mysterious, its waters reflecting the fading light. Eadric traced a finger along the worn leather of his sword's sheath. "I will not stay here forever," he said softly. "There is a life I must reclaim, a home I must return to." Frida nodded, understanding the pull of distant lands and old ties. "And yet you will always have a place here, with us." He smiled faintly, the crease of memory and hope mingling in his eyes. "You have shown me what it means to belong." Their hands brushed briefly, a contact charged with unspoken promises and the bittersweet knowledge of parting. The wind carried their silent farewell, mingling with the cries of seabirds soaring high above. That evening, as the village gathered to celebrate the turning of the season, Frida stood at the center of the great hall. The firelight danced across carved beams and painted faces, illuminating the circle of kinship that had been reforged through courage and compassion. Jarl Thorvald approached, his imposing frame softened by the weight of shared trials. He laid a heavy hand on Frida's shoulder, a gesture stripped of command and filled with respect. "You have changed Ravenholm," he said quietly, "not as a wife bound by tradition, but as a Shieldmaiden who chose her own path." Frida met his gaze steadily, the flicker of the falcon amulet catching the light.
"The gods grant us the strength to follow the paths we choose, not those laid before us." Halfdan the Wise's voice rose from the circle, ancient and steady. "And in those choices the threads of fate are woven anew. The past may shape us, but it does not bind us." The hall filled with nods and murmurs, a chorus of acceptance that echoed beyond the walls into the long night. As the celebrations waned and stars blanketed the northern sky, Frida slipped outside to stand once more beneath the vast expanse. The cold air filled her lungs, sharp and invigorating. The fjord whispered secrets in its endless rhythm, and the gods watched silently, their ancient eyes reflecting the flicker of human courage. She thought of the child sleeping safely in the village, of Eadric's quiet strength, of the battles fought and the peace earned. The chains that had once bound her heart were broken, replaced by a freedom hard won and fiercely guarded. With steady hands, Frida raised her face to the stars, whispering a prayer not for power or glory, but for guidance and grace. The falcon of Freya seemed to take flight against the black velvet sky, soaring beyond the fjords and forests, beyond fear and doubt, into the endless horizon. Her story was far from finished, but in this moment, beneath the watchful gaze of gods and ancestors, Frida Gunnardóttir was truly free, and the future was hers to claim. The cold night wrapped Ravenholm in a quiet shroud, the kind that presses on the skin and seeps into the bones. The village, still recovering from wounds both seen and unseen, lay beneath a sky heavy with stars, their pale light casting fragile shadows across the snow-dusted rooftops. In the stillness, the crackling of the fire by Frida's cabin was a small defiance against the vast silence. Frida sat close to the flame, the warmth a stark contrast to the chill that lingered in her chest. The weight of recent days pressed heavily on her mind. Battles fought, promises broken, lives forever altered. Beside her, the child slept, wrapped in furs soft and thick, a fragile heartbeat in the quiet. The flicker of the firelight danced across the scarred lines on Frida's forearm, tracing the tattoo of the Valkyrie that had been inked in blood and sweat, a symbol of both duty and transformation.
Her thoughts drifted to Eadric, whose presence had stirred a tempest inside her, a storm she had neither sought nor expected. His quiet dignity and the strength of his convictions had cracked open the armor around her heart. She had seen in him not just a prisoner, but a man shaped by hardships, a bearer of knowledge and hope from lands far beyond the fjord's cold reach. The Jarl's proposal, once a beacon of security and honor, now felt like chains forged in shadow. She had chosen to break them, to step beyond the path laid out by tradition and expectation. It was a choice fraught with peril, but for the first time in her life, it was hers alone. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of earth and distant seas. The night sky, vast and unyielding, seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. Frida's fingers brushed the amulet of Freya at her neck, a talisman that had guided her through countless trials. Love, war, and transformation, the three threads woven into her fate. She whispered a silent prayer, not for the gods to decide her future, but for the courage to walk it. The world was changing, as were the hearts of those who lived within it. Mercy had proven itself not a weakness, but a weapon sharper than any blade. Trust had forged an alliance between the Shieldmaiden and the Saxon, a bond that defied old enmities and ancient grudges. And in the fragile smile of the child she saw a promise, that even in the darkest winters life could find a way to bloom. Her gaze lifted to the stars once more. In their cold fire she found not judgment, but a quiet understanding, a reminder that even amidst the harshest storms, the human spirit could soar free. The path ahead was uncertain, shadowed by the memories of loss and the weight of new responsibilities. Yet Frida Gunnardóttir stood unbowed, ready to face whatever dawn might bring. For she had learned that true strength lies not in the sword alone, but in the fierce will to choose one's own destiny. As the fire dwindled to embers, a soft wind stirred the night, carrying a whispered truth across the fjord and into the hearts of those who would listen. Freedom is the hardest victory of all. If this tale of courage and choice has stirred your spirit, let it be the first of many journeys we share. Join us as we continue to explore the worlds carved by honor, conflict, and the human heart. Subscribe, and together we will walk through the shadows and into the light of Viking lore yet untold. In the quiet between night and dawn, they understood. Compassion can be the sharpest weapon a Viking wields.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started and we really need your support. And may the gods grant you a legendary life.